Joshua 14 is our reading for the day, and Brother Braden's going to lead us in that. Caleb. His courage, commitment, and constructive influence. Brother Nat's going to give his words of exhortation.
Well, that was pretty dramatic. And just to be clear, my name is not Caleb. I thought, is there a Caleb coming forward? But no, we're all good. All right. Thanks, Brother Darren. I guess a bit of inspiration for this morning's exhort. We did Caleb in Sunday school a few weeks ago in the adult class, and I guess in the spirit of Caleb, some of the things that we learnt there, I'd like to sort of overflow into all of you, and hopefully you get something out of it as we did as well. So this one here with Caleb, it is relevant to us because we are standing here on the edge of the promised land. And as we looked in Joshua chapter 14, chapter 13 actually gives us a little bit of context here as well. Chapter 13, verse 1, it says there that Joshua was old and stricken in years, and the Lord said unto him, Thou art old and stricken in years, and there remains yet very much land to be possessed. So Joshua is pretty old, and there's still a lot of land that needs to be possessed. Joshua is not a young man anymore. In fact, there's only one actual other person who is as old as Joshua, and that is the man Caleb, his friend, the man that we read about this morning in Joshua chapter 14. And so this morning we just want to have a look at 4 characteristics of this man Caleb from Joshua 14. We're going to see, number 1, Caleb the Kenizzite. Number 2, we're going to see Caleb's completely committed heart. Number 3, we're going to see Caleb as the constant, courageous warrior. And finally, Caleb as the constructive influence amongst the nation. So 4 elements. We've got the Kenizzite, the courageous, the committed, and the constructive man Caleb. And so hopefully with these 4 characteristics, hopefully we can see that in his character, and that we can also as individuals, as families, and as an ecclesia, be equipped for another week in God's service. And so as we read Joshua 14, the chapter actually opens with the land being divvied up and divided. There's been 7 years of removing the Canaanites of war from the areas of the land. At the end of verse 1, it says, it talks about, well, at the start, these are the countries. At the end there, so it talks about these areas being distributed as an inheritance. Over in chapter 15, verse 1, very similar. This is the lot of the tribe of the children of Judah. Talks about the borders and things like that. So it's all about, the context is all about the land being divided. But in amongst this scene, in the middle of it, of inheritance and distribution of the land, we see a faithful man, Caleb, step forward. And as the rest of the nation is ready to receive their plot of land, there was an old man, Caleb, right at the front of the queue. He wants his inheritance and he wants to partake in the land. And as we read there, there's the same gleam of enthusiasm that he had in his eyes when he spied out the land many years before. He hadn't lost that. He hadn't lost any spirit when we last heard about him 45 years earlier. He wants his inheritance, he wants his mountain, and he particularly wants Hebron. And we're introduced to him in verse 6, and it talks there, about the middle of the verse, says, Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite. If you don't know much about Kenizzites, we talked a little bit about this in our Sunday school. Kenizzites were the descendants of Esau, actually. They were not Jewish. They were not partakers of the covenant of Abraham. And I think this is driving this lesson home. Caleb's name, as we might know, graphically means a dog. So he is a Gentile. He is a stranger from the covenant of God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He hasn't got the proudest or noblest of backgrounds at all. His family line doesn't stem from a prominent figure in Israel at all. And if we didn't know more about him, we would perhaps think that he'd be despised by a lot of the Israelites. And throughout the Bible, whenever we read of Caleb, it constantly repeats and constantly emphasises that he is Caleb, the dog, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite. Just 3 times in this chapter alone, we have it in verse 6, Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite. Over in verse 13, Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. And verse 14, Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite. And it is perhaps a background that maybe a lot of people wouldn't have felt comfortable with. But what we want to see here is it did not hinder Caleb in his faith and in his commitment to the hope of Israel. Caleb wasn't a person that was going to focus on his past. He was going to let that go and he was going to move on, and he was more interested about the future. And I think it's the same for us too. A lot of the times we can hold on to the past so much that even if we've done, say, maybe something wrong, everyone else has forgiven them. God might have even forgiven them, but they cannot forgive themselves, and they perhaps sit on the sidelines. And when it comes to the truth, not wanting to get too involved and just take a back seat. Sometimes we think we're too far away from the promises and the hope that God has given us. But this is not the example of Caleb. We see him letting the past go and move right to the front of the truth. He is here at the front of the line, ready to take his inheritance. And he's ready to get the lot that was promised to him so many years before. He was not content to be a Gentile out on the fringe of the nation and camped out on the outer edge. And later on in 1 Chronicles chapter 4, his family is actually listed as a part of Judah's posterity. He's amongst the lineage of actual Judah, the kingly tribe, the most prominent tribe in Israel. So Caleb's not sitting on the sidelines at all. His nephew, Othniel, actually was the first judge in Israel, and we're going to look at Caleb's influence on him towards the end. So the point is that even though Caleb, the dog, known as the Kenizzite, he didn't let his background, he didn't let his past stop him from moving forward in his life. And the same should be with us. We gather here this morning to consider our past, to consider our actions over the last week, or maybe something even in our life in the past that we've never come to grips with, and it hinders us in the truth. Come over to Philippians chapter 3 and verse 13 to 14, because the Apostle Paul actually writes some inspiring words, which are very similar to the example here of Caleb. Philippians chapter 3, verse 13 to 14. And the Apostle Paul also had a pretty coloured history too, as we know. And it says there, "Brethren, I count not myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forth unto those things which are before, I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Jesus Christ." And so the example of Caleb this morning is to forget the things that are behind and to press forward, and for ourselves to gain the forgiveness with our God, ready to start a new week, perhaps ready to start a new phase in our lives with a clean slate. The past has gone, and we can move forward with a determined spirit and press toward the mark of the prize of the high calling of God. And for Caleb, this mark was Hebron. And he was going to obtain that goal. He was absolutely committed towards that. And we're going to now have a look at the second characteristic of Caleb, complete commitment, in verse 7 to 10 of this chapter. Before we look at those particular verses, let's just come back just to set a little bit of a context for it. Numbers 13, verse 30. Because in Numbers 13, believe it or not, we haven't heard a single word from Caleb since this time. So in 45 years, there's not a single word that Caleb says. These are the last words of Caleb that we've read about in the Bible. Numbers 13, verse 30. "And Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it." So the last comment we read before Joshua 14 from Caleb were these words here, these faithful words. Now, come back to Joshua 14. Remembering he's telling the people we're able to overcome it. We know the story. Joshua 14, end of verse 7, says, let's read verse 7. 40 years was I when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him word again as it was in my heart. So those words in Numbers 13, verse 30 were the words that were in his heart. And we know out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. So Caleb, after spying and looking at the land in Numbers 13, getting that huge cluster of grapes right near Hebron, as a young man, he would have been bursting with enthusiasm. His heart was full and he was ready to begin a life in the land. But as we know, the negative words of the spies sent that dream that he had, that goal that he had, spiralling to the dust. And as a result, the people and Caleb himself were sentenced to another 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And you know, Caleb at that point, he could have stormed off into the desert on his own, or even if he stayed with them, he could have wandered around complaining, causing strife for everybody for 40 years. He could have sided with Korah on the way through. Many opportunities he could have just pulled away and broken away. But this was not the character of Caleb the Kenizzite. He was a man of complete commitment, because whenever he speaks, he is always on God's side. And look at verse 8. Nevertheless, my brethren that went up with me made the heart of the people melt, but I wholly followed the Lord my God. So the first words that we hear from Caleb in 45 years, who after wandering through the wilderness for 40 years, no fault of his own, he shows his complete commitment to his brothers and his sisters. A complete, constant, positive influence who stuck with his brethren, as he says there, my brethren, through thick and thin. And he now once again encourages them to take the land. Come over with me to James chapter 5, verse 9. And the epistle of James actually is quite famous as well for using the phrase my brethren all the way through the epistle. So we've talked about Caleb using the phrase my brethren, and here in James chapter 5 and verse 9, and we could use these words really of Caleb, couldn't we, in James 5 verse 9, grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth before the door. And Caleb was not the one to bear a grudge, but he drew alongside of his brethren to help them. And Paul also sums up the character of Caleb in Galatians chapter 6 verse 2, where he says, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. And Caleb did this day in and day out amongst the very people who had squashed his hope. He didn't want a promotion. He didn't want to boast about that. He just wanted to inspire others in their faith to God. And we are here this morning to remember our Lord, who made the ultimate sacrifice to inspire us as well. Come back, you're in James there, hopefully, just come back to Hebrews chapter 2, and we'll read verse 9 to 14. Talking about Jesus, in Hebrews 2 verse 9 to 14, we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honour, that he by the grace of God should taste death for every man. For it became him, for whom are all things, by him are all things, in bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For both he that sanctified and they who are sanctified are all of one, for which cause he is not ashamed to call them brethren, saying, I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the ecclesia will I sing praise unto thee, and again I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children which God hath given me. For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that has the power of the death, that is the devil. And we're here to remember Christ, aren't we? Who called us his brethren. Christ was a man who gave his all for his brothers and sisters. As I come back to Joshua chapter 14, we've seen here that Caleb's focus was towards his brothers, his sisters, and especially towards his God. And we can't go past this phrase, which Caleb is so well known for, that he wholly followed the Lord my God at the end of verse 8. Actually, it's mentioned 3 times in this chapter. Verse 8 at the end, wholly followed the Lord my God. End of verse 9, wholly followed the Lord my God. And the end of verse 14, wholly followed the Lord my God of Israel. Worth colouring those ones in if you haven't. It's also actually mentioned even more than just this. Numbers 14 verse 24, Numbers 32 verse 12, Deuteronomy 1 verse 36, all in relation to Caleb. So the word holy here actually means to be full or to overflow. The exact same Hebrew word is in 2 Kings 9 verse 24. If you remember this story where Jehu drew back a bow, and it says there with his full strength, and he smote Jehoram between the arms, and the arrow went out at his heart. Jehu pulled back the bow to his full extent, so much so the arrow went straight through Jehoram. And it's that kind of strength that Caleb is putting into his service in the truth and for his God. He is giving his all, his whole strength, his whole being for his God. And for Caleb, it was worth it. He had treasured God's promise in his heart for so long. You know, he remembered exactly where God had promised him Hebron. In verse 7, it says, sent me from Kadesh Barnea. He knew exactly where God promised him Hebron, Kadesh Barnea, and he remembered the date that he was given the promise as well in verse 10, 45 years ago. So what was it that over 45 years gave this man the strength to wholly follow God? For 45 years. And why did Hebron mean so much to him? Well, to do that, we've just got to go back to Numbers 13 again. Why did this place, why did this time mean so much to Caleb? Numbers 13, verse 23. This is where they came, the spies, and they came unto the brook of Eshcol, which is interesting. We're going to come back to that. The brook of Eshcol. They cut down from thence a branch with one cluster of grapes. That's where they got the grapes from. They bare it between two upon a staff, and they brought of the pomegranates and of the figs. So you might notice in verse 2, this is they came to Hebron. See, they ascended by the south and came to Hebron, and this is verse 23 near the brook of Eshcol. Now, the brook of Eshcol actually means, Eshcol means grape cluster. It's named after a man who is by the name of Eshcol himself. He was an Amorite chief back in Genesis chapter 14, verse 13. And it's recorded of Eshcol that he was confederate with Abram, or what the Hebrew actually means is that he possessed the covenant of Abram, which is really interesting because we've got Caleb here, only a couple of miles from Hebron, at a place that is named after a Gentile. Caleb the Kenizzite is here, named after a place who possessed the covenant of Abraham. So what an inspiration for Caleb the Kenizzite, who really wanted to become a part of the promises of Abraham as well. Hebron was where Abraham was buried. So for this Kenizzite, Hebron was his link as a Gentile to the promises. It was the promises that Caleb longed for that made him want to wholly follow Yahweh. And look at the language back in Joshua 14, verse 9. It is terminology, it is language of promises. As we read through it, just have a picture of some of the other phrases here that you might remember through the Bible. Moses, this is Caleb talking, Moses swore on that day, surely the land wherein thy feet have trodden, we've heard phrases like that about Abraham, shall be thine inheritance and thy children's forever, because thou hast wholly followed the Lord my God. Terminology, this is language of promises. So Caleb's conviction has put him here amongst the same caliber of men like Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. His conviction is impacting his family. It's going to be his children's inheritance as well. And Caleb here never lost his first love. When he first entered that land 45 years ago, he fell in love with Hebron. He fell in love with the promises, and he never, ever lost that. And even though he hadn't seen Hebron for 45 years, he remembered it, and he was completely committed to that. And so the question for us this morning is, how do we compare to the commitment of Caleb? Do we still have our first love? Do we remember the commitment that we had perhaps at our baptism when we first fell in love for the truth, when we saw the hope that we have? But what about this? What about having the commitment to do another 45 years in the truth? Because when Caleb spied out the land, the signs of the times showed that the kingdom and entering the land was close. They were right on the border. But it was actually going to be another 45 years away. So do we have the same faith, the same commitment as this man Caleb to last another 45 years in the truth? To have the same zeal as our first day in the truth? Can we say, as Caleb could, that we are and that we will be 100% committed to the truth. Because he had the same commitment, that's our key word, same commitment, the same strength 45 years later. Verse 11 says that. It says, I am as strong, or my strength was then, even so is my strength now. I am as strong this day. And the word strong there at the start, I am as strong this day, the word strong means vigour or vigorous. It's the same word in 2 Samuel 11 verse 15 where Joab was told to set Uriah in the hottest part of the battle, in the most vigorous part of the battle. And Caleb is here at 85 years old and saying, I am as vigorous now as I was then. I'm very hot for this. You might remember in Revelation chapter 4, Jesus wishes that the Laodiceans were either hot or cold. He wanted them to be either like refreshing or on fire for the truth, but they were just lukewarm. And Caleb here shows us the fire that we should have. The fire should never die, should never dwindle and become lukewarm. It needs to be constantly fed by what we would say, maybe the oil of the word, to maintain that vigour and that courage. This is the constant courage of Caleb. And in verse 12, Caleb actually asks for his inheritance. And he says to Moses, to Joshua, in verse 12, now therefore, give me this mountain, whereof the Lord spake in that day. For thou heardest in that day how the Anakims were there, and that the cities were great and fenced. If so be that the Lord will be with me, then I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. So he asks for the mountain or the hills of Hebron. And Hebron actually was known and had the reputation as being the city of giants. That is where the three giants, I won't go back to Numbers 13, but I did have it down here. If you go back to Numbers 13, it actually lists the brothers, the giants who were there. Hebron was where they saw the giants for the very first time, the children of Anak. So this request by Caleb is really bold. Even for Caleb, it shows his courage. But it's courage not in his own strength, is it? It's courage in God's strength. Because there in verse 12 it says, if so be that God will be with me. And so as we think about Caleb in these few verses, he recognises God's hand in his life in the past, because in verse 10 it says there that God has kept me alive. So he recognised God's hand in the past, but he also trusts God for the future as well. He was not boastful that it was his own courage. He was very dependent on God. And again, men of great calibre always recognise this. Daniel and his three friends, when they were faced with a fiery furnace, they said in Daniel 3 verse 17, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And so this is the key to constant courage. We have courage because we know that if God is for us, who can be against us? And the same lesson comes out of Paul in Philippians 4 verse 13. Paul says, I can do all things, but through Christ who strengthens me. So Caleb is setting his aim high, even though Hebron is perhaps one of the most difficult areas for Israel to conquer, where the giants are there. He was not content with anything less than that. He is a man of altitude. He is not content with being average. He needed to be better. And we should follow his example and meet that challenge as well. The challenge we have of being like Christ. And as we're here this morning to think about the huge mountain of Christ's character, we have to aim high. We have to set our affections on things that are above. We have to trust in God and have that courage to get to the top. You know, the interesting thing about this area here of Hebron was that it actually already conquered this area. Just come back to chapter 10, verse 39. It seems very strange that they're talking about this again. Chapter 10, verse 39, it says that, or verse 38 for context, that Joshua returned and all Israel with him to Debir and fought against it. And he took it, and the king thereof, and all the cities thereof, and they smote them with the edge of the sword, etc., etc. He left none remaining, as he had done to Hebron, so he did to Debir and to the king thereof. So, already done it. Chapter 11, verse 21 to 22, let's have a look at that. And at that time came Joshua and cut off the Anakims from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains. Verse 22, there was none of the Anakims left in the land of the children of Israel. Already done it again. What's happening here is that over time the Anakims filter back slowly in. Later in Judges chapter 1, they reappear in the same area. And the lesson here, Caleb is expecting to fight for his inheritance. For Caleb, fighting the Anakims was a constant battle. He knew it was going to be like that. And life in the truth is a life of action, a life of endeavour, and a constant fight. Sometimes we might be struggling to take that mountain of the character of Christ because our enemy of flesh and sin is constantly coming back and reasserting its head. Because many of us probably already know this by now, that baptism is not a total conquering. It's not all over. This is a constant battle. And it doesn't matter whether you're 25, 45, or even 85 like Caleb, there is never retirement from the truth. There's always an enemy to fight. And some of the final words of Christ, even in Revelation, are emphasising that. They say, to him that overcometh. Overcometh what? The lesson of courage from Caleb is to keep on keeping on. It's not just about courage, but constant courage over and over to overcome with our faith in God. And so our final point is that the example of Caleb here was contagious. And this is the final characteristic, that Caleb's constructive influence flowed out amongst the people around him. And so we want to look at 5 verses, actually in the next reading, in Joshua chapter 15, verse 13 to 17. And I think from memory this is actually where our Sunday school class came out of, was Joshua 15. But anyway, Joshua 15, verse 13 to 17. And unto Caleb the son of Jephunneh he gave a part among the children of Judah, according to the commandment of the Lord to Joshua, even to the city of Arba, the father of Anak, which city is Hebron. And Caleb drove thence the 3 sons of Anak, Sheshai, and Asherman, and Talmai, the children of Anak. And he went up thence to the inhabitants of Debir, and the name of Debir before was Kirjath-Sepher. And Caleb said, he that smiteth Kirjath-Sepher and taketh it, to him will I give Achsah my daughter to wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, the brother of Caleb, took it, and he gave him Achsah, his daughter, to wife. So, notice his inheritance there in those little verses is amongst the children of Judah, again emphasising his desire to be right in the middle of the ecclesia. He wasn't satisfied with those fringes. But it was this drive that he encouraged in other people around him as well. And we might ask the question there, verse 16, he says, can somebody else go and take off Kirjath-Sepher? That'd be great. Why did he ask somebody else to do it? Because all of a sudden he think, well, I actually am a bit old and I'm a bit worn out. I've got Hebron now. That's really not my job. Somebody else can do it. Well, that's not the Caleb we know, is it? And here he is encouraging other people in the fight. And he encourages Othniel, who is actually his nephew. This incident is again over in Judges chapter 1. Just come over to Judges chapter 1, verse 10 through to 20. I might just try and skip over a few of these verses because it is about 10 verses. But it says there, and Judah went against the Canaanites that dwelt in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron before was Kirjath-Arba, and they slew Sheshai. There's the brothers there again. Verse 12, Caleb said, he that smiteth Kirjath-Sepher and taketh it, to him will I give Achsah my daughter to wife. Verse 13, Othniel goes up and does that, and he gave him Achsah his daughter to wife. And it came to pass, when she came to him, that she moved, this is Caleb's daughter, that she moved him to ask of her father a field. And she lighted from off her ass, and Caleb said unto her, what wilt thou? And she said unto him, give me a blessing, for thou hast given me a south land. Give me also springs of water. And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the nether springs. And it goes on. The children of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up out of the city of the palm trees. Verse 18, Judah took Gaza. Verse 19, the Lord was with Judah, drove out the inhabitants of the mountain, and could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley. And verse 20, they gave Hebron unto Caleb as Moses said, and he expelled thence the 3 sons of Anak. So you can see here, everyone's getting involved. You've got Judah, you've got Caleb's daughter, you've got Caleb's nephew. And this incident here of Caleb going up to Hebron is actually a major motivation, almost a trigger point for all of Judah now to take up the sword themselves against their enemies in their area as well. But you notice Caleb's daughter? You can see Caleb's spirit coming through the daughter there in verse 15. It says, "You've given me the southland." Caleb says, what are you after? He says, "Well, give me a blessing, for you've given me a southland. Give me also the springs of water." And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the nether springs. She also was not content with the average plot of land and asked for the springs of water. It shows the same determined character that her father had, wanting that refreshment, wanting that permanency, wanting the promises with the land. And Caleb's daughter and Caleb's nephew were both encouraged in the right way. If anybody knew this, Caleb knew that negative service, negative words in the truth influences others, as he found out when he went with the other spies 45 years earlier. But also he knew that positive service, positive words also influences others as well. And here this small group encourages and sends a ripple effect to all Judah by their constructive influence of one man here, Caleb. And this man, Othniel, his nephew, who took Deba, he's mentioned early in Judges as well. Because after Israel were established in the land, and in the Judges we read about Israel turning away from God, and their very first cycle of sin and turning away from God, and then trying to turn back to God, the man that God raises, the man who was already on the scene, and became their first deliverer, was Othniel, a man who no doubt consistently served God while the rest of the nation was on this roller coaster ride. And that's because Othniel was a man who was inspired by the consistent, the courageous example of Caleb the Kenizzite. And so here we are at the bread and the wine, symbols which represent negative and positive. Negative in the sense of the bread, the putting down of the flesh, as Caleb did when he wandered around for 40 years, not thinking of his own self, not complaining. But also Christ, who in Isaiah 53, who is with us as despised and rejected. He's borne our griefs. He's carried our sorrows as we walk through our wilderness as well. But on the other hand, we see the positive, the wine, where we can use the energy that we've got in positive service, like Caleb did, by wholly following his Lord, his God, the commitment. His strength was as strong as it was at the beginning of his life, and the truth as it was, and he won at the heights of Horeb, and that's his courage. And of Christ also, it's recorded in Isaiah 53 that God will divide him a portion with the great. He will divide the spoil with the strong, because he's poured out his soul unto death. So Christ also had that commitment to devote his whole life to God, and the courage to pour out his soul unto death. And so before us now we have the emblems, the mountain of Christ's character. So let us also be strong to overcome and conquer and to help others to ascend to these heights.